Hello everybody, welcome to the Wonky Angle, where I talk about electronic music, both new and old. And today, we're talking about a band that's never been talked about before in the history of mankind. Well, surprise! I know this is off-brand. I usually cover exclusively electronic music on this channel, but 2 years ago I did a ranking of all the Yes albums, and that went over great, so I hoped to maybe do some more like that every once in a blue moon. Still not regularly, but, you know, every once in a blue moon. I'd mentioned back then that I'd be willing to do something like this for Pink Floyd at some point. People sounded really excited at the prospect, even though I just mentioned it in passing. Even got some urging from my parents and some other relatives to go through with it too, at the time. There still aren't very many bands out there outside of electronic music that I'd be willing to do an off-brand ranking like this for. Mostly just other prog bands like maybe the Moody Blues, or the Alan Parsons Project. I could do one for Steely Dan someday too. All those bands are a huge part of my life, and in some cases even more so than Pink Floyd. But I figured, hey, let's go for the one band that I have that strong personal history with, that is most easily guaranteed to get an absolute ton of views. So now I'm talking about Pink Floyd. I will freely admit that the intro of this script has just sat here for over a year, with no actual progress on the ranking itself, until like just last month. For a while, I just found myself feeling weirdly unmotivated by this topic, perhaps because it was such a freaking obvious one to do, or because my connection with Pink Floyd has sort of waned in recent years and I hadn't felt compelled to put them on nearly as often as I did back in high school. Some of their material has gotten pretty overplayed, either thanks to the classic rock radio stations here in Chicago, who love playing tracks out of context from their albums and watering down the experience, or just because I listened to them too much on my own time over so many years. But fact remains, they are still extremely formative to me. They're not my first prog band. I think Alan Parsons and Yes go a little further back. But I got into Pink Floyd right around the same time, and had that nice long period in high school where I was very much obsessed with this band, and delving into all the nuances of their catalog. And it was great to, actually be this into a band that I could actually talk with other people about in real life, and, start actual conversations with aunts and uncles and friends of my dad. Most of my extended family doesn't really share my music taste, let alone my immediate family, but this felt like a big exception. Well, besides my mom, she actively hates Pink Floyd, but never mind that. This is a catalog that a lot of people know very well, and breaking it down in the way I'm about to has become a bit of a time-honored tradition in music discussion circles, if a very big and time-consuming undertaking. I still wanted to anyway because I knew it would be fun and I wanted to reawaken my old interest in them. Shout out to Mike the Snare for his video having finally gotten that spark to light inside me to actually get back to work on this. I know well that every album of theirs has something to talk about, and I hadn't really sat down with a lot of these projects in years. Would be nice to have all my thoughts down in writing. I had a lot of fun with the Yes video, I imagined I'd have fun with this too, and this is a slightly smaller catalog with much fewer boring time-waster projects, so it might be a little easier to put together. Now, I also know that there is roughly a 0% chance that people are going to completely agree with all my rankings here, especially since I'm only in my mid-20s and all their albums besides Endless River came out before I was born. And also the fact that most of what I listen to and what I focus this entire channel around is electronic music. And my taste in the way I digest music is probably not going to be the same as your average rock listener. I tend to focus less on lyrics and more on, the overall sound, so there you go. But yeah, everyone has completely different takes. Every era of their career and every individual project of theirs has a shot at anywhere in the ranking, higher or lower, be it thinking their big popular projects are too overrated, or their less popular ones are too underrated, or vice versa. I don't think it's fully possible for a Pink Floyd album to even be called underrated or overlooked at this point. This band is so ubiquitous it's near impossible to make a truly hot take on them at all. Even something like Obscured by Clouds has a dedicated fan base. But everyone takes away something different from this catalog, and that's kinda what's got them to stand the test of time as well as they have. Just know that, as per usual, it's all just my opinion, and you can feel free to disagree with it. It's purely ranked based on my own personal enjoyment of the albums at the time of making the video, and that's it, nothing else. I might not even agree with it later. But, yeah, I think that's enough prelude, may as well just get into it. This is Pink Floyd, Worst to Best. And number 15, I have The Final Cut. The Fletcher Memorial Home for I'm not sure how contentious a pick for worst Floyd album this is. I know it has its fans, and I can definitely understand why. But, Jesus, I've never been able to stand the final cut. It is such a gigantic slog that features basically none of the qualities I always enjoyed in Pink Floyd's music. It feels like a footnote and continuation of what Roger Waters was exploring on The Wall, which already felt like it could be his own solo album from like a lyrical and thematic level. But instead of being this giant sprawling concept album that combines lots of themes both personal and far-reaching and being applied to lots of different tracks that all have distinct and memorable hooks, the final cut is basically 43 minutes of Waters mumbling to himself about how he hates war over loads of super spare and empty-sounding instrumentals. Musically and aesthetically, it gives me little to nothing to latch on to. Waters' alternatively mumbling and yelping, barely on-key voice gets quite grating over time. And sure, there's some neat sax solos on The Gunner's Dream and Two Suns in the Sunset, and there's a bit more groove and energy put into The Hero's Return and Not Now John, though the latter feels like the equivalent of Waters saying, "Oh right, I forgot this was a Pink Floyd album," and throwing in something that actually utilizes the rest of the band last minute. And even these cuts I don't really feel like I'd care enough to want to come back to. The production, whenever you can actually hear it, sounds fairly 80s and not very Pink Floyd-like aside from the one moment. Really all this album has going for it is the lyrics, which I will admit does consistently show Waters putting a lot of emotion into every moment and does effectively convey his angst over all the physical and psychological damage that war does. I wouldn't say it's underdeveloped, but a lot of it is very plain-spoken and straightforward and doesn't even really present itself in all that interesting a way. Like, he talks about his dad's death on the opener, The Post-War Dream, in such a basic way that ends up making it feel like shallow whining, unfortunately kinda setting the tone for the rest of the album. And I also especially didn't care for, say, the interlude One of the Few. While I think it's meant to be about survivor's guilt from the perspective of a war veteran, it's delivered in the same way as all these others, as if Waters is inadvertently talking about himself having survived capitalism and become mega successful and feeling guilty about it, which... fuck off. I suppose I can get behind a track like the Fletcher Memorial Home, where Waters basically goes off on all the big world leaders of the 80s and how they're ruining the world, which we are still feeling the effects of to this day. Also, it does help that he changes up his vocal delivery a bit more on that one. And I suppose I'm okay with When the Tigers Broke Free, as it just directly tells the story of how Waters' father died in World War II over an entirely orchestral backdrop, though that one was originally a leftover from The Wall and probably would have hit with more impact in that context if that album had been able to fit it. Here it doesn't stand out as much because all the other songs here are pretty much about the same thing. But that's it. There's not a single moment here that rises above okay for me. This album hinges literally everything on you, the listener, being able to viscerally connect with the subject matter, and while it does its best to convey the horrors of war, again, it's all presented in such a plain and uninteresting way that seems to assume you already know and can relate to what he's talking about. The kind of thing that is most likely to connect with those who have already lost someone specifically to a war, or at least know someone who does, and much less likely to connect with those who haven't. And with a lack of hooks, interesting musical ideas or performances, or any kind of easy surface-level element to be able to pull more casual listeners in beyond the subject matter, the result is a project that will work wonders for very certain subsets of people who are willing to put in the effort, but for others, including myself, will just end up as an absolute chore and snooze fest. And even if I found the material at its core more compelling, it would still feel like a Pink Floyd album in name only, and the way it puts all its eggs in the lyrics basket is kinda antithetical to the way I personally digest music. Great if you were able to get into it, but this one's a hard pass for me. Whoopsh. At number 14, I have Obscured by Clouds.
On the outside looking in.
Is there anyone who actually has this album at the top of the ranking, or even near the top? Because if so, that'd actually be pretty cool. Hearing more people defend something like this would be interesting, since it seems a lot less people talk about it. That'd be a pretty unorthodox take. I mean, it's not my perspective. If you ask me, this one gets overlooked for a reason. There's just not much to see. Yeah, you'd think Pink Floyd doing a film soundtrack would be more interesting than this, and I do think their soundtrack for More actually was, but this one is just mid. Not to say it doesn't have its occasional moments. I do have a particular soft spot for What's the Deal. That's the one vocal track from here that could have fit well on their other albums from this era and held its own. Really nice heartfelt tune, that one is. The album starts and ends with 2 pretty neat atmospheric instrumental cuts that I quite like. Absolutely Curtains ends in a bunch of like tribal singing or something. That kind of reminds me of the football chanting from their track Fearless. Obviously not as good here, but it's kind of neat. But there's not much else beyond that. I guess Stay is a passable Richard Wright piano-driven track. I guess The Gold It's In The and Free 4 stand out for being a bit more up-tempo, and the latter for its particularly morbid lyrics. But that's kind of scraping the bottom of the barrel. I wouldn't say I'm that huge a fan of those latter cuts either. This album's biggest crime is just being entirely forgettable. It basically has 1 track I could remember longer term at all, and everything else is like a scattered collection of tracks that are like less good versions of tracks from Meddle. There really isn't any novelty to this one that sets it apart from their greater catalog that you might get from one-off side projects like these. I mean, this one at least delivers a lot more of the core of what I enjoy out of Pink Floyd than the final cut. It actually feels like a full band effort where all the members mattered instead of just Roger Waters. But they're not really bringing their A game either. It's just an album that exists. Pretty inessential stuff. Whoopsh. At number 13, I have A Momentary Lapse of Reason.
Restless eye across a wind.
There was a part of me who went into this ranking hoping to be nicer to Momentary Lapse since it's the only Pink Floyd album my mom likes. But boy did this one hit a weird note when I came back to it. See, this was the first Pink Floyd album to not feature any contributions from Roger Waters, who at the time had split off the band entirely and was even attempting to sue the other members of the band into never being able to use the Pink Floyd name again. Charming. David Gilmour now being the band leader and not having nearly as much of a pessimistic worldview as Waters leads to this album being a heck of a lot more easily listenable than something like the final cut. But much like that album, Momentary Lapse isn't very Pink Floyd-like. It's a lot more like a big 80s stadium rock kind of album, like combining Floyd with U2 or something. And while it does certainly have its moments, this is a lot more of a dated and generic listen than pretty much any of their other albums. And that mostly comes down to the production, though this album is a little weaker on the song front too. Really only 1 track here was an active turnoff. The Dogs of War was trying so hard to be edgy and biting and just not pulling it off. Kinda cringy if I'm being honest, especially given how much more authentic it feels when Waters wrote about war. But most of this album's biggest issue is how radio-friendly it's all trying to be, and unfortunately this isn't a Yes 90125 kind of case where the style ends up surprisingly fitting them well and they get to make a lot of great 80s pop rock. When I listened to this, I was mostly just caught off guard by how off-brand it was instead of being pulled in by the material actually on display. And of the 11 tracks, there's a surprising amount of filler? More generic cuts like On the Turning Away and Yet Another Movie just leave me underwhelmed more than anything. And those vocoder interludes are definitely a thing that exist. That said, I'll give you this album as 4 tracks I really like. On the pop end, Learning to Fly and One Slip may still feel a bit on the generic side, but they do have the tunes to back themselves up. And I do quite like the synth xylophone progressions on the latter. And there's 2 instrumental cuts I really like too. Opener Signs of Life is a pretty epic synth piece that sounds kind of inspired by old Vangelis and Tangerine Dream type material. And Terminal Thrust is probably my favorite cut in the bunch, as a particularly solid groove is formed with lots of great sax and horn solos placed on top. And I guess Sorrow is good too. I'm not really huge on those cheesy, overbearing guitar solos in the beginning, but the track does grow into something better as it goes on. Ultimately, this is a decent album. It's cool, it's perfectly inoffensive and listenable material, but it still feels like something important is missing that makes it not feel like a Pink Floyd album as much as it could. And it's not just that Gilmour isn't as good a lyricist as Waters, I tend not to actually care much about that aspect. It's mainly coming down to how obviously dated the production is, the kind of thing that feels like it fits more on our family dinner playlist than something I'd actively want to come back to a lot on my own time. And something about the way it's structured makes it feel almost incomplete in comparison with other albums of theirs. Like it took a lot out of them just to get something together at all, and they settled for less than their best. I mean, given how troubled the production was, it's still admirable that it turned out as enjoyable as it is. Just, it's still kind of an underwhelming point in their career. But while we're on the topic of one-off moments in the Floyd catalog that feel especially off-brand in retrospect, whoopsh. At number 12, I have The Piper at the Gates of Dawn. Man, did this bring back a lot of memories. This definitely feels a lot scrappier and more of a product of its time than a lot of other Floyd projects, and Syd Barrett's vision certainly makes this project stick out like a sore thumb in their catalog. One that I remember quickly growing and shrinking on me a lot back when I was in high school, since I didn't really know how to parse it. But still, there is a definite charm to this album that you can't get anything like elsewhere. Its odd mix of intense jamming experimentalism being wrapped around in this childlike sense of whimsy, the stark contrast between playful songs about gnomes or hide-and-seek or scarecrows succumbing to their fate, makes the weirder moments like Interstellar Overdrive and Pow R Tuck H feel all the more intense and nightmarish, even if I'm not a fan of those yelpy vocalizations on the latter cuts. And I was never ever gonna forget any part of Bike after my first listen. If you want the most intense aspects unique to this album summed up in a nutshell, it's that track. Also, if you ever needed a warning about the dangers of using LSD, it is this entire album. It's the kind of experience that can make you feel like you're starting to lose your own mind right alongside Barrett, and it is more than a little chilling seeing the switch-offs between all this hardcore experimental stuff and the cheerful tracks that feel more like desperate attempts to hold on to childhood fantasies. As for why it's so low in the ranking, that mainly comes down to replay value. While this album is interesting as a character portrait for Syd Barrett and can help add context to their other projects, its impact oddly drops off quickly with repeat visits, and some of those lackluster moments like Take Up Thy Stethoscope and Walk slowly kill off my urge to want to come back to it. If I want my fix of 60s psych rock Floyd, this will do the trick, but there's also lots of other more replayable and on-brand options in their catalog. This is something I need to be in a specific mood to feel the urge to want to put on. And that's not to say this is a bad project by any means. On first return visit, it really hit a lot of nostalgia notes, and I was about to rank it at number 10 or something. And I do still feel like it's one of their more cohesively constructed projects from this early era. But I also got the feeling that there was only so deep you could actually go with it. And I found much of it oddly forgettable, too. I think it says something that I'd entirely forgotten about the gnome called Grimble Grumble. Interstellar Overdrive and Bike are the only two cuts here that I've consistently been able to remember. Even an iconic track like Astronomy Domine, I eventually entirely forgot the tune to. Now again, even at this project's absolute worst, it's still pretty solid psych rock, but it's also a little unprofessional sounding, blends into its surrounding scene, and kinda makes me want to put on some moody blues instead. Those guys made doing LSD sound like a more refreshing and uplifting experience, even if this is probably a more realistic portrayal of what the drug actually does to you. Gonna be honest, there's even a part of me who wonders whether this album would be nearly as well remembered as it is, if not for all the greater successes these guys embarked upon without Syd later on. Well, not to say it'd be completely forgotten to time without the likes of Wish You Were Here to prop it up. It's not like this isn't still regarded as a psych rock classic in its own right, but hopefully you get what I mean. On a personal level, I don't see myself tossing it out entirely. There's an experience here that I have some room for in my life, but it's not a good example of the kind of thing that only Pink Floyd could pull off, and it's not one I feel like putting on very often. Whoopsh. At number 11, I have Ummagumma. Just so we're clear, I'm only counting the studio half of this album and not the live half. Counting the concert kind of feels like cheating to me. And I know I did kind of count the concerts when I ranked the Keys to Ascension albums in my Yes ranking, though in those cases it was a lot harder to justify the studio material from there as their own thing, or place them in the ranking at all without the concerts included. Ummagumma's studio disc is definitely its own separate thing where you can ignore the live material entirely and it'll still feel like a complete experience. Not to take away from the concert, it's quite solid all around. You get careful with that X Eugene on an album and that's only a good thing. But whenever I think about Ummagumma in general, I always think about the studio half by itself without the concerts, and it's actually easier for me to pin down where this might sit in the ranking if I just ignore the live half. As for the studio album, okay, I know this is pretty low, and honestly I wanted to be able to defend this thing more since it's easily their single most out there experimental project of all. Back when I first heard it in high school, I didn't like it at all aside from maybe Grantchester Meadows and The Narrow Way, and everything else barely seemed to qualify as music. A good example of how I felt at the time that, experimentalism should only ever be handled in moderation, and always at least be tied down to some kind of musical structure, which pretty much none of this is. In the years since, I think I've gotten that stick out of my butt regarding experimental music. I have a lot more of a stomach for this kind of material than I used to, and feel like at the absolute worst I can respect people who do really try to go out of the box and completely ignore conventional structure like this. And after coming back to this thing to reevaluate my feelings, I mean, I do in fact like it more than I used to, but it's still not one of my favorites from them. I kind of have a feeling they weren't really bringing their absolute A game to this one. This album is so sparse and empty, and there's always so little going on, more like an ambient record. And it can work well in that way, but it is a bit hit and miss. My favorites are still mostly the same as they were back in the day. The Narrow Way being the clear winner for me, as Gilmour stitches together 3 disparate, creepy-sounding guitar-driven tunes that all kick ass and sound really cool, but don't feel outright out of place next to all these way more abstract and meandering pieces either. And Grantchester Meadows is a really nice mix of field recordings and really low-key acoustic guitar folk, if maybe not necessarily my favorite thing they did in that vein ever. I definitely like Sisyphus more than I used to. When I was still in high school, it used to scare the crap out of me, and that organ jump scare in the middle of part 4 still really throws me off. Though I did find myself getting into its opening sections with that 10 Commandments style intro and that whole classical piano section that directly follows it. And the way the whole thing slowly gets darker, more dissonant, and weirder sounding as you progress through each part, that's cool. The Grand Vizier's Garden Party is okay. Mostly just an extended drum solo that certainly has an odd and almost otherworldly flavor to it that's pretty neat, but mostly just meanders aimlessly and doesn't really develop enough of a mood or atmosphere to pull me in. And Several Species of Small Furry Animals is just a straight up dud. The tape manipulations in the beginning are kinda cool at first, but as Waters piles on more ridiculous sounding vocalizations and eventually goes into that whole part where he does this over-the-top Scottish accent, it just gets super grating. Even as far as musique concrète pieces go, there's much more interesting and listenable stuff out there than this. Hell, even if it's not way more listenable, I'd rather listen to the Beatles' Revolution No. 9, since that's a lot more ambitious and properly frightening, instead of a one-note, borderline joke track that's mostly just irritating. Side note, I guarantee you if Pink Floyd had made that track and put it on this album, it'd get way more defenders. It would not make the album better, but it would make sense. But yeah, ultimately this project gets ranked above Piper, since I feel like the more experimental background music-y nature of it feels like it has a better chance of slotting someplace in my life. And of course I can respect it for the chances it took and how freeform and out of the box its entire approach to everything was. It's a good project, but definitely not a great one. I just wish I found it more investing than I do. But as far as early period Floyd making near ambient background music goes, there's another project that gets a bit more out of me. Yeah. At number 10 I have More.
And it's high time.
This seems to be a popular choice for worst Pink Floyd album, but gotta be honest, that kind of feels like a cop-out. Says the guy who put Obscured by Clouds near the bottom. Okay, it's not like I don't get why this would be an easy pick for the bottom spot. I hardly think it's great myself. More is about as scattershot as soundtrack albums come. You can randomly run into a moment like a Spanish piece that's absolutely a skip and gets kinda painful with the hard panning and goofy vocalizations. One of the worst tracks they've ever made. Beyond that, there's a lot of cuts that feel underdeveloped, a lot of sloppy mastering choices, and even some occasional questionable sequencing. A track like the Nile song might make more sense in the movie and is fun out of context, but is super out of place in the context of this album and totally kills the vibe for me. Honestly, never cared for it much to begin with, even if it is a lot of people's favorite. But if I'm in the mood for some Grantchester Meadows type laid-back psychedelic folk material, this project will give me my fill, and possibly even more so than Ummagumma itself. Tracks like Cirrus Minor, Green is the Color, and especially Cymbeline can really hit for me in that vein. The latter's definitely my favorite cut in the bunch. Ibiza Bar is a pretty good louder cut, and its trippy layers of guitar make it fit better in context than the Nile song did. And there's some more experimental instrumental cuts I really like, such as the mysterious tones of Main Theme, the quirkier, more fast-paced flares of Up the Khyber, and the straight ambient drone piece, Quicksilver, all really helping flesh the experience out. If only Obscured by Clouds had this kind of variety. I'll stop crapping on that album. As a complete whole, this album's too clunky and all over the place for me to say it's one of my biggest favorites from them overall, but I do think it deserves better recognition in their catalog. It has its place in my life, and I'd still say there's more good here for me than bad. Though I won't deny that there are better albums of background music they've put out that feel more cohesive, such as... At number 9, I have The Endless River. look, Pink Floyd making an almost entirely instrumental ambient album is exactly the kind of thing designed to appeal to me specifically, so much so that it might even be strange that it's not even higher up in the ranking. I will admit this album's identity as the final Pink Floyd album puts it in a bit of a weird spot, having to be a send-off to the entire story of Pink Floyd as a whole and a tribute to Richard Wright, who'd passed away 6 years prior, mostly built out of demos he'd worked on left over from the Division Bell sessions. And it is more or less the safest possible way this idea could have played out, right down to several sections being direct callbacks to old albums of theirs, like how It's What We Do sounds like a cross between parts of Shine On You Crazy Diamond and Welcome to the Machine, Alonzi 1 sounding kind of like Run Like Hell, Talkin' Hawkin' reprising the Stephen Hawking generated voice snippets from Keep Talking on the Division Bell, even Skins having some percussion patterns that remind me a little of A Saucerful of Secrets. Also, there's a track called Autumn 68, titled as an homage to Richard Wright's Summer 68 from Adam Heart Mother, though unfortunately those two tracks don't actually sound anything alike. It's a callback in title only. This album's existence may feel like a one-off novelty at the end of the day. I tend not to look at it as their true swan song, since I feel the Division Bell carries that honor much more effectively. But this feels more like an epilogue to the Pink Floyd story, an attempt to bring all eras of their career full circle, being made out of material left over from their later period, focusing on the aesthetics and sound of their most successful middle period, but with the underlying ethos of their earlier, more experimental period. The way it does focus so heavily on these purely instrumental passages and creating an overarching sense of place and a vibe without caring as much about creating cohesive and memorable individual songs. And I think for what it is, it's really well done, and even kind of necessary to some extent, since I feel like Richard Wright never properly got his due for how important he was to the equation of what made the band so special. It's great to have a whole album dedicated to him specifically. Now, most of the 18 tracks here mostly seem designed to directly flow into each other and build together as one giant cohesive piece. Technically 4 sides, but they are kind of meant to run together too. I think side 3 in particular provides the most musically interesting passages in the bunch, switching from lonely pianos in The Lost Art of Conversation, to smooth jazz with On Noodle Street, to the faster-paced rock of Alonzi 1 and 2, to a melancholy church organ interlude, Autumn 68, and finally ending with the above-mentioned Talkin' Hawkin', one more kind of piano-focused piece with the Stephen Hawking bits again. Also, if I'm being honest, those Stephen Hawking snippets fit better in the context of this album than they did on the Division Bell. It's a much cooler and less embarrassing moment than the track title might have you believe. And there are lots of other bits all around that stick out to me. The more experimental percussiveness of Skins, the more lighthearted jazz rock of Anisina with lots of excellent sax solos, and even all the less standout parts are nice. You get lots of melancholy synth passages and other cuts that even border on post-rock. And then there's the ending and only track with actual lyrics, Louder Than Words, which I distinctly remember being my least favorite part when the album first dropped, since I felt like it massively paled in comparison to High Hopes. That said, while that track still feels like a more fitting farewell to the band from like a musical standpoint, I've come around on this one from how it fits for them lyrically, having been written by Gilmour's wife, Polly Sampson, and based on her observations of the behind-the-scenes dynamic of the band themselves. Like, in their prime, they barely seemed to talk to each other at all while making their music, but still coming up with brilliant material that showed them all working perfectly together. There was still some kind of unspoken communication that really worked for them. And I think it works as Gilmour delivering this meta statement on the band, and with a nice, heartwarming sentiment on their legacy. Got some good chord progressions in there too. While I think it'd be difficult to argue that The Endless River reaches properly great territory or is even a must-listen in any way, I'm still pretty satisfied with the way it turned out. I still keep it around and even feel compelled to put it on every now and then. They're not closing their career out with a bang, but for what it is, I like it a lot. Whoopsh. At number 8, I have The Wall. I don't know what to do with The Wall. On one hand, it's so often considered one of the greatest albums of all time, a perfect 10 out of 10 and all the rest of it, and I fully understand why. It is an insanely intense listening experience that goes into so many themes exploring the absolute worst all of humanity has to offer, both from the broad explorations of war and fascist hate crimes, to the smaller scale of Waters' own personal angst and all manner of childhood trauma, from the death of his father in World War II, being raised by an overprotective mother and being abused by his teachers, having his wife cheat on him, etc. And tying it all together seamlessly into one perfectly cohesive story told over 80 minutes and 26 tracks. The story is relatively easy to follow. I had no trouble figuring out how every single little piece, or brick if you will, fits into the greater whole just with one return listen. On the other hand, I gleaned very little personal enjoyment from actually listening to it, and I don't particularly plan on listening to it on my own time ever again. I mean, thematically and writing-wise, it's fantastic, if more than a little stuck up its own ass, which was kind of inevitable given the juxtaposition of themes of literal war with the inner demons of a million-selling rock star. I don't think he ever properly conflates them, but he comes close. Side note, it always kind of rubbed me the wrong way that this story, which was so obviously personal and borderline autobiographical to Waters himself, was being told from the perspective of a character literally called Pink Floyd, as if to say Waters saw Pink Floyd purely as an extension of himself and not the combined efforts of 4 or 5 different people. But that's neither here nor there. It also really doesn't help that the listening experience is so intense. I haven't even seen the movie besides a few isolated clips, but even without visuals, moments like waiting for the worms in the trial were enough to give me freaking nightmares as a high schooler. And the first half isn't any more pleasant either as you go through this story with every single character, including the narrator, being absolutely horrible human beings. All of it kind of makes me want to throw up. That's entirely by design, sure, but how some people are able to put this thing on regularly is kind of beyond me. And it seems like a bad sign to me that the 2 easiest tracks for me to get into in the bunch are also by far the 2 most overexposed, Another Brick in the Wall Part 2 and Comfortably Numb. The classic rock radio stations and even some of the more general music stations here in Chicago have completely worn those tracks into the ground. Out of context, they just put me in a bad mood, and I was ready to just say I never need to hear them again as long as I live. Though, in context, they were the most easily accessible and Pink Floyd-ish moments on display. Well, okay, I do also really like Hey You and Run Like Hell. The latter's actually managed to survive overplay, and still remain a fun listen, even if it's about committing hate crimes. And I guess I don't mind hearing Young Lust every now and then, but that's about it. The rest works only if you take it in specific context of the full album and just doesn't really stand out on its own outside of that. And an even more pressing problem for me personally is that this album, just musically and sonically, is nowhere near as interesting as the other Floyd albums that led up to it. Most of this stuff is just super straightforward pop rock with occasional orchestral touches that mostly just show up throughout the second disc. And the orchestral stuff honestly isn't that interesting either. I mean, there is the obvious exception of The Trial, which is an insanely over-the-top orchestral piece with Waters doing like 5 different ridiculous accents as caricatures of the various characters that appeared elsewhere in the album, and again, totally gave me nightmares as a kid. But that's just one track, and nothing else here even remotely sounds like that. And sure, there's loads of sound effects peppered throughout both halves of the album, but these aren't so much actually immersive or setting up any kind of sonic environment in the way most of my favorite Pink Floyd material does, as they are providing context to the album's story and narrative. They're just plot devices and fairly on-the-nose ones at that. It's not really a prog rock album so much as it is like a rock-influenced, audio-only stage show or musical. A rock opera, to use a term people actually use. While the songs and melodies here are usually just catchy enough and containing enough of that old nostalgia factor to carry this album for me, the production is super slick, polished, simplistic, and almost borderline sterile. Most of the songs do little more than the bare minimum of what is needed to communicate what Waters needed to tell his story. I didn't even notice Another Brick in the Wall had a disco beat until it was pointed out to me somewhat recently. That's how flavorless this production comes off to me. In other segments, I've talked about enjoying Pink Floyd albums more for the overarching vibe they can create, and occasionally even in the vein of ambient music. But this just flat out does not work in that context at all. And it leads to a listening experience that, while I have a ton of respect for its songcraft and storytelling, and how well all of it succeeded at what it was going for, is just not particularly well tuned to the way I personally listen to and digest music, and isn't really my thing, save for a few isolated moments. I do like the album a lot. Again, I fully understand how some people got a 10 out of 10 experience out of it, but I really don't need to hear any of it again myself. And hopefully that can somewhat explain why I might have a random pick like this next one above it. Whoopsh. At number 7, I have The Division Bell.
Beyond the horizon of the place.
Okay, I know how weird this placement looks, especially given how unimpressed I was by Momentary Lapse on return visit. But I believe The Division Bell to be the far stronger, more on-brand, and fully realized version of that album. It may be more comfort food-ish than pretty much anything else in their catalog, and not quite as well structured, well written, or unique sounding as their big classics. If you told me that you just thought this just felt like a watered-down version of what they did in their peak, well, you wouldn't entirely be wrong. But I still kinda love it. This album came together a lot more smoothly than Momentary Lapse, with Wright back as a full-time member, and that more refreshed and amicable atmosphere during its development does come across in the music itself, which is light years better than Momentary Lapse. So much better produced, so much better songs and hooks, so much more emotionally involved too. Tracks like Pulls Apart, A Great Day for Freedom, and especially Wearing the Inside Out still prove that these guys can still bring the emotional heft of their best work. And it's great to hear Wright singing on the latter alongside all the sax solos from Dick Perry. There's occasionally a cut or two that wouldn't have been out of place on Momentary Lapse, see the Stephen Hawking sampling Keep Talking, or especially the joyous U2-esque stadium rock of Take It Back. But these have way better hooks and feel way more natural coming out of Pink Floyd. They even have time for some particularly spacey instrumental cuts in Cluster 1 and Marooned that work great. And the biggest standouts could stand among the most memorable moments in their catalog overall. See What Do You Want From Me, and especially the closer High Hopes. The latter is legit one of my favorite tracks they've ever done, and it always felt like the big climactic finale to the entire Pink Floyd story as a whole, and was just as much of a tearjerker in delivering as much of a sense of bittersweet finality as it needed to. Even if The Endless River turned out to be their actual ending, again, I see that album more like an after-credits scene to their career or an epilogue, where The Division Bell is more like their true swan song. It feels like it works too well in that specific context, and back in my high school days before Endless River even came out, I always thought it worked so perfectly as a farewell to the band. Now, this album is far from perfect. There are a few cuts like Coming Back to Life and Lost for Words that, while good, are kind of redundant in that context and don't really add anything that other tracks here couldn't. The second half of the album does drag a little in general. And like I mentioned before, stylistically it mostly falls in the shadow of a lot of their previous work. But it's a rehash that they still put their all into, and one that I have a lot of personal attachment to. I listened to it all the time in high school, and coming back to it now, it still holds up as a personal favorite to this day. Whoopsh. And number 6, I have Animals. God damn it, I really wanted this one to be ranked higher. I went into this ranking fully expecting it to end up at number 2 or something, since it's the peak period Floyd album that is least completely overexposed. You don't see random Animals merch lying around nearly as frequently as you do for the likes of Dark Side the Wall and Wish You Were Here. But to say it's not in the same ballpark of overexposure would be kind of disingenuous. There may not be an obvious track on here that fits in the classic rock radio stations format like Time, Money, Another Brick in the Wall, Comfortably Numb, Wish You Were Here, or Have a Cigar. But God knows they still tried with Pigs 3 different ones. I do still hear that one often enough where its original impact has been noticeably muted, and the fact that it sounds so similar to Have a Cigar probably doesn't help either. On top of that, I did notice that of all their albums, this has to be the one that delves the furthest into
Gorsh, we really do be living in a society, though.
Territory, and its angry ruminations on the state of humanity are more vague and broadly sketched than any of their other albums in this period. Well, okay, it's more focused than Dark Side, thanks to it all being tied together with the George Orwell concept, but it doesn't feel quite as emotionally involved as their other projects from this period. It's lacking a bit of sentimentality to balance out the anger. And Pigs on the Wing, that pair of 1 minute sorta love songs that bookend the project, are way too scant to be enough. Still, for all my issues with this project, fact remains is that this is still a pretty big favorite of mine in the Floyd catalog, and their social commentaries remain on point and relevant to this day. Listening to Pigs and its rants against corrupt politicians feel especially righteous in this day and age. Hearing that Waters played this in recent live tours during the Trump administration, featuring a lot of anti-Trump imagery, is pretty awesome. I do kind of wish the song did more for me musically beyond being a little better and more fleshed out companion to Have a Cigar, but I'll still take it. Sheep was my favorite track back in high school for having a lot more propulsive groove to an extent that few other Floyd tracks have. It's got plenty of progression, and I especially love the last 2 minutes with all those descending guitar licks. Kicks so much ass. But as of this most recent marathon, I think my new favorite moment from this project might just be Dogs. Perhaps because it doesn't sound as musically in line with other Pink Floyd songs, just like chord progression and melody-wise. And the way it switches off between being a more fast-paced acoustic guitar-driven piece to a slower, I guess, jazz rock style, and that whole diversion where it just echoes Gilmour's voice. Just sonically, it's a lot more fun to take in than I ever gave it credit for. The whole album's pretty epic and still absolutely deserves the hype it gets. Just happened to not be as big a favorite during this marathon as it might have in years previous. I think I tended to gravitate a bit more towards albums that don't get played as often, like the next one. At number 5, I have A Saucerful of Secrets. I didn't realize how much the nostalgia factor on this one was so baked in for me, but yeah, I really used to love this one in high school and come back to it all the time. This probably fueled a lot of my early interest in, this style of 60s psych rock, and all that immediately came back to me when I put this back on for the first time in years. It also helps that Saucerful just so happens to be one of the most consistent projects of theirs to come out of this era. There's no bad tracks here in my mind. Sure, Corporal Clegg is a bit out of place, being much more energetic and containing loud kazoo melodies, but it is still really catchy and I have a lot of good memories of it playing it as a high schooler. I still find its pissy goofiness to be compelling in its own weird way. Also, being a sarcastic joke track highlighting the pointlessness of war and the military in general. Definitely no foreshadowing for Roger Waters' subject matter on later albums there at all. And I suppose I don't love Jug Band Blues, can feel a bit aimless and doesn't have as solid a tune as most of these other tracks do, but it's still quite haunting and carries a downtrodden and offbeat mood that makes for a fitting send-off to Syd Barrett's time in the band. Also, the random Salvation Army Orchestra diversion in the middle is kind of a nice touch to add to the freakiness. It's a solid closer to this thing. And those are the album's lower points. Tracks like Let There Be More Light or Set the Controls for the Heart of the Sun have become big iconic Pink Floyd moments in my mind that I've never fully forgotten even after all these years, especially the latter of those two, which I've somehow seen performed live by a tribute band on 2 separate occasions. And the Richard Wright cuts, Remember a Day and Seesaw, I may not have remembered them as well, but coming back to them now, I was really struck by how gorgeous they sound and how nice their melodies are. I'm not really sure why they didn't stick with me as much, and they've become much bigger favorites of mine while doing this marathon. The former is one of the most emotionally resonant cuts Wright's composed, and the latter is all these really cool uses of xylophones. Always nice. And of course, the 11-minute 4-part pure experimental trip that is the title track is definitely one of the coolest sounding pieces they've ever done in this style. A lot more fun to revisit than the similar material on something like Ummagumma. While I can understand it's definitely not for everyone, this wasn't exactly going to make it on the family dinner playlist or the classic rock radio stations, but that is probably to this album's benefit, as that means I only hear this specifically when I want to and am in the mood for it. At the end of the day, this is the kind of material that really reminded me of how I got so obsessed with this band back in the day, and it all still totally holds up. But while we're on the topic of the best of pre-Dark Side Floyd... Whoopsh. And number 4, I have Meddle. This album is the transitional point between early experimental era Floyd and their classic Roger Waters-driven period, and pretty much delivers the best of both worlds. Obviously, most of this album is overshadowed by the 23-minute closer Echoes, and I will not deny that it's still one of my favorite tracks they've ever done, combining long instrumental passages that all link into each other seamlessly, and even working in that weird ambient noise section in the middle, which might honestly be my favorite part of the whole piece. And those plinky keyboard notes in the beginning are nothing short of iconic. But the rest of the album is great too. I might like the opener One of These Days even more than Echoes. It's probably the single biggest banger they've ever made. It has a level of propulsion and energy unmatched in their entire catalog, save for maybe the last 2 minutes of Sheep. And even then, I don't think that track as a whole has this one beat either. A Pillow of Winds and Fearless are solid laid-back tunes that deliver just as much energy as their titles imply. Saint-Tropez is a nice little easy-going, jazzy, bossa nova-tinged acoustic cut that is nice and pleasant in a way that you don't get out of any other Floyd tracks, and has some particularly satisfying melodic progressions and chords. And even if Seamus is the clear weak link on the album, just this really basic acoustic blues track with a dog howling over it, I really don't mind it too much. It's still kind of a cute curiosity and far from the most egregious low points in their catalog. There's really not much of anything here for me to complain about. It has plenty of variety, but doesn't have any moments that openly clash with one another, or don't at least have something for me to enjoy. And of course, the intro and ending cuts bring this project up as high as it is on their own. And it's nice and easily replayable, one of those Floyd albums that isn't massively overplayed either by me personally or by the public at large, but still gives off all the same effect you'd want out of their best material. And while I'm on the topic of albums, there's that deliver earlier period Floyd at their best but with even less overexposure. At number 3, I have Atom Heart Mother. Yes, I genuinely believe this album is on par with the obvious ones, not just the best thing to come out of their earlier experimental period, but also the only Pink Floyd album that's never fully left my regular listening rotation. And I'd even go as far as to say this is the closest they ever came to making an album that I could listen to anytime. It's still not an anytime album, but it's closer to being one than the vast majority of their others. If the lowest points on this album for me are the mildly pleasant, if not as sonically interesting, ballads, If and Fat Old Son being pretty good, I think that speaks to this album's baseline quality in my eyes. Everything else is absolute top-tier Floyd for me and shows them exploring lots of new territory they never really touched again since, but would have been great if they had. The title track here may not be the smoothest or most well-blended mix of rock and symphonic music I've ever heard. See that weird chanting on the funky dung section for the most off-putting example. But as a longtime defender of Yes's Time in a Word, I can't really complain too much. I mean, an epic 6-part instrumental suite with a full orchestra and choir and lots of horn players and a whole sound collage section with weird electronic sounds and overdubs of previous sections, all the while still managing to get some pretty solid emotional and memorable tunes in the process. It's just as expansive and epic a journey as it sounds on paper. Pompous, absolutely, but having a lot of fun in the process. I'll take this over the orchestral sections of The Wall and the final cut any day. Summer 68 seamlessly blends a nostalgic piano tune with bombastic horn-driven, almost early Chicago-esque pop rock and Beach Boys-style vocalizations. Seriously one of the most underrated cuts in their catalog, and probably the best track Richard Wright ever wrote that doesn't have Claire Torrey on it. I don't understand why it never got more attention. But the real biggest star of the show for me is Alan's Psychedelic Breakfast. People talk about this one as if it's nothing but 13 minutes of sound effects of one of their roadies eating breakfast and that's it. And I guess I can kinda see why the inclusion of those sound effects turn people off, even if I personally think they sound kinda neat, and maybe even have like an oddly soothing borderline ASMR feeling to me. Even as someone who is not into ASMR or any of that stuff. But obviously the sound effects are not the reason I love this track. Those are just like transitional elements tying together 3 whole instrumental passages, which I believe are all among the best they've ever done. The bright and cheery keyboard work of the first section, Rise and Shine, the laid-back acoustic guitar loops being slowly panned from one ear to the other in second section, Sunny Side Up, and best of all, the whole band coming together for the big triumphant finale section, Morning Glory. They sound great, have plenty of emotional resonance, and even properly put me in a good mood. And let me tell you, it is extremely rare for a Pink Floyd composition to put me in a good mood, let alone be something that would actually work well for waking up in the morning. I can understand if this album's experimental elements turn people off, but I don't think it's nearly as out there or difficult to listen as people say it is. Even in its weirdest moments, they never outright sacrifice their tunefulness. All these tracks still have really good songs and instrumentals at their core, and there's something kind of innately refreshing about a Pink Floyd album that doesn't demand you take it so dead seriously and even has a few kind of silly moments. A fairly relaxed listen that still has loads of stuff going on just sonically. It may just be the one Floyd album best suited to the way I personally listen to and digest music in general, hence how it's managed to get so much replay value out of me even when I'm not necessarily in a Pink Floyd kind of mood. Hell, while it may have started to lose a bit of its impact in more recent years due to overplay, unlike their big classics, this overplay was 100% voluntary and no one's fault but my own. I love Atom Heart Mother to bits, and only the 2 most obvious and similarly personally overplayed choices rank above it for me. Whoopsh. At number 2, I have The Dark Side of the Moon. I'm not biased. What even is there to say about an album like Dark Side? I suppose in more recent years, I have much more frequently seen the take that this album is actually really overrated. Like, the critical tide is finally, like, really starting to turn on it after all these decades of inescapable ubiquity and ridiculous overhype that no single album should ever have in the first place. Getting constantly told for 40 plus years that an album is objectively the greatest of all time will do that to people. And I don't think I've ever considered it like 10 out of 10 greatest of all time material myself either. But it is still easily in 9 out of 10 territory for me, and still has a lot of residual power left over from it being my first ever exposure to Pink Floyd at all, that no amount of overexposure is going to be able to completely kill off. Not to say it hasn't come close in several moments, though. The track Time, in particular, is mostly been ruined by overplay. The classic rock radio stations near us, again, they used to play that one out of context all the freaking time, and good god do I never need to hear that one again as long as I live. It's much too integral to the flow of the album for me to want to do away with it entirely. I can still get some enjoyment out of it thanks to all the build-up and support all the other tracks provide, but without the album context, it'll legit just put me in a worse mood. Also pretty ambivalent on Brain Damage. It's fine, but not one I'd ever pick to listen to on its own. And while I like Breathe and Eclipse, they don't quite have the same punch they might have had years ago either. But even with those weaker spots, as a complete whole, this one's weirdly survived a lot of the overexposure. By some miracle, I still love Money just as much as I did when I was a teenager. The 7/4 groove is still a bop, the sax solos are top-notch, and it makes a heck of a lot more sense to take this one out of context since nothing else on the album sounds like it. None of the instrumental cuts have lost any bit of their impact for me either, be it the psychedelic meanderings of Any Color You Like, the fast-paced rushes of synth progressions of On the Run. What a surprise that the electronic music guy happens to mark that one as a favorite, right? And of course the absolute emotional masterwork that is The Great Gig in the Sky, the actual best track that Richard Wright ever wrote. But of course, my favorite track on here by a fairly substantial margin, and almost certainly my favorite Pink Floyd song overall, is Us and Them. This was the first Pink Floyd track I ever heard, and what convinced me to pick up Dark Side for the first time. And it blew my mind even more when I heard how much it hit, especially being placed right after Money. I don't even really have any words for it. The slow, peaceful build it has, to its big, dramatic, emotional payoffs, and even better sax solos than those on Money. It may be just as much of a downer as 90% of Pink Floyd's catalog is, but I could hear this one out of context repeatedly for another decade to come, and I'm sure I'd be able to immerse myself in it and get just as much of an emotional gut punch from it that I always have for years already. It and Great Gig are still regularly able to get me to tear up, which is more than I can say about even the best moments on Animals in the Wall. This album may not be as, like, wall-to-wall perfect as so many people say it is. There were definitely tracks on here that hit for me way more than others, but the super tight flow and construction of the album and the way every track is built to directly support the next one, as if everything was part of a single 43-minute piece, prevents the weaker moments from losing their impact as the most overplayed moments from The Wall have. And as someone who's well documented as loving albums with continuous mixes that directly build tracks into each other, I mean, I pretty much have this album to thank for inspiring so many people to try and build albums this way. Sort of including myself, even if it wasn't the first continuous mix I ever heard. There's still nothing quite so satisfying as getting to hear an album pace itself and flow in the way that Dark Side of the Moon does, and remains an absolute masterwork in those specific departments to this day. Even better than my actual number one pick in that way. While its insane ubiquity is helpful to no one, a world in which this didn't become a giant era-defining classic wouldn't fully make sense to me. I'd say its reputation is still well-deserved. But may as well get to that number one pick, which may be an even more obvious placement than this one. Whoopsh. At number 1, I have Wish You Were Here. Well, surprise. Gonna be honest, I fear that this album is starting to get on a similar level of overexposure that Dark Side of the Wall have, as the popular tide turned away from the former. Feel like everyone's flocked to this one to replace it. I don't think I'd blink if people were to call this one seriously overrated either. There's a few cuts where the overplay is starting to set in for me as well, most notably the title track, which I seemingly hear everywhere, even outside of classic rock radio stations, and to a lesser extent Have a Cigar, which I hear a lot too. They haven't been as completely eviscerated by overplay as Time or Comfortably Numb, but they've come pretty damn close, and I'm not particularly interested in hearing either one out of context of the album. But we're not yet at the point where their impact has truly been dulled, especially in fuller album context. When I started work on this ranking, I was even expecting this to be down at number 4 or something, but I can still put this thing on in its full entirety, and it'll hit for me just as much as it did when I was still in high school. And I watched as its most overplayed song still hits that same raw emotional note that it hadn't since however many years ago the last time I put this album on in full was. And even Darkside couldn't fully pull that off. And that emotional connection is, of course, the main element of Wish You Were Here that put it at the top. Not just my own connection from having listened to it all the time in high school, but more importantly, the connection between the band and their absent previous frontman, Syd Barrett. Pairing moments like the smaller scale but sentimental title track with the angrier cuts make them that much easier to swallow, since they feel more balanced out. The sarcastic parody of a record executive on half a cigar next to the much more dystopian-themed music industry disc Welcome to the Machine. The latter's gotten a pretty decent amount of radio play around here as well, but I've never gotten sick of that one. Of course, one of their most electronic cuts featuring loads of menacing layers of synths wrapping around the spare acoustic guitar chords really resonates with me. But for all the Pink Floyd compositions I've heard that just show Roger Waters pissed at some greater element of society, there's no moments I feel like he's penned quite as resonant in the same way as Shine On You Crazy Diamond, where he actually extends genuine feelings towards an old friend he misses without ever making it about himself or making any attempts to sound cool for the sake of sounding cool. And that balancing out with all the rest of the band's contributions to these expansive musical meanderings, from Gilmour solos to right synth passages to the whole band jamming together to more sax solos to eventually a reprise of their old single See Emily Play at the very end of the album as one last tribute to Syd. It may already widely be considered one of their best tracks ever, if not their best full stop, and I cannot disagree. It's easily like in my own top 3 favorite moments from them. Now, is this album 10 out of 10 material? Also no. I know well from experience that this album is absolutely not infinitely replayable, and that it's not difficult to get to a point with it where you can't glean any new insight out of it. I've had many listens where it didn't hit. But still, of all the albums of theirs to land with the most impact on me personally, both when I was younger and right now, the project that best balances everything that I enjoy in their music and hits the strongest emotional note, Wish You Were Here felt like the most fitting pick I could go with as my personal favorite Pink Floyd album. And that's it, that's the ranking. But of course, this is just my opinion. You can feel free to disagree with it, but I'd like to hear your thoughts, so leave the comments in the comment thing down there. I'm sure they'll be very respectful. Shout out to my Patreon supporters. They're awesome people. You want to add yourself to that list or make me review something, link to my Patreon is in the description. I only get electronic requests. But yeah, that's pretty much it. That's all for today. See you next time.